better? Yeah? Okay, cool. Thanks, Adam, for waking everybody up for me. And then making them all move forward, so then, I don't know. Anyway, good afternoon, everyone. We had a lot of great talks today, and I'm really excited to be back at RubyNation. I was here 3 years ago for the second talk I ever gave, and it was on Active Record. So this one's not about Active Record, but actually that talk is how I started contributing to Rails in the first place. I'm Eileen Uchitelle. I'm a senior systems engineer at GitHub on GitHub's platform systems team. That's a bit of a mouthful, but it basically means that my team is responsible for working on internal and external tools that are for the GitHub application. So we work on improving Ruby, Rails, other open source libraries, and I have somehow become personally responsible for upgrading GitHub from Rails 3.2 to 4 to 5 in the future, one day. I like that slow clap from you over there, Paul. I'm also the newest member of the Rails core team, which means that I have finally gotten access to the Rails Twitter account. That's all we want in life, right? You can find me on GitHub, Twitter, SpeakerDeck, anywhere at Eileen Codes. It's what I use everywhere, unless I don't want you to find me, and then I use something else. So today we're going to talk about the new system testing framework in Rails that I spent 6 months building. We'll take an in-depth look at my process for building them, roadblocks that I hit, and what's unique about building a feature for open source software. But first, let's travel back in time a few years. Some of you may remember the infamous 2014 RailsConf, where DHH declared that test-driven development was dead. He felt that while TDD had good intentions, it was ultimately used to make people feel bad about how they wrote their code. DHH insisted that we needed to supplement test-driven development with something that motivates programmers to test how their applications function as a whole. In a follow-up blog post titled "TDD is Dead, Long Live Testing," David said, "Today, Rails does nothing to encourage full system tests. There is no default answer in the stack. That's a mistake that we're going to fix." So it's now 3 years later, a little longer than 3 years later, after DHH declared that system testing should and would be included in Rails. And I'm happy to announce, as other people have announced earlier, that Rails 5.1 finally makes good on that promise, because they're now included in the default stack. The newest version of Rails includes Capybara integration to make it possible to run system tests with zero application configuration required. Generating a new scaffold in Rails 5.1 application will generate all of the requirements for system testing without you having to configure anything. It just works. This is probably a good time to address exactly what I mean by system test. You may be familiar with Capybara being referred to as an acceptance testing framework. And while system tests use all of those same libraries, the ideology behind system testing in Rails goes deeper than that. The intention of system tests is to test your application as a whole. This means instead of testing individual pieces or units of your application, you test how those pieces are integrated together. With unit testing, you test that a model has a required name, and then in a separate controller test, you ensure that the controller throws an error, but you can't actually test the user physically saw the error. With system testing, that becomes possible. You can test that when a user leaves out their name, the appropriate error is actually displayed in the view. System tests also allow you to test your JavaScript and how it interacts with your models, views, and controllers. That's not something you can do with the other testing frameworks that are built into Rails. Before we take a look at what it took to build system tests, I want to look at what a system test actually looks like in a Rails application. When you generate a new Rails 5.1 app, the gem file will include the Capybara and Selenium WebDriver gems. Capybara is locked to 2.13 and above, so your app can use some of the new features that were pushed upstream to Capybara, like mini test assertions. In your test directory, a system test helper file is generated called application SystemTestCase. This file includes the public API for Capybara setup for system tests. By default, applications will use Selenium with the Chrome browser, and a screen size of 1400 by 1400 for screenshots. If your application requires additional setup for Capybara, you can include all of that in this file instead of mucking up your test helper. Any system test that you write is going to inherit from application system test case. Writing an individual system test isn't different from writing Capybara tests, except for that Rails now includes all of the URL helpers, so you can just write post URL or post path instead of having to do the whole include Rails URL helper thing that everyone does. Or you just ignore it and you use strings, which sucks. This is a simple test that navigates to the post index and then asserts that the H1 selector is present with the text post. Then in your terminal, you can run system tests with Rails test system. Rails doesn't run system tests with the whole suite because they can be kind of slow, since they sometimes run a real browser and a whole other thing. And everyone we talk to actually runs them in a separate CI build, so we made that easier. Instead of having to separate them, it's already split up. And let's take a look at system tests in action. I recorded the demo because they run too fast. Now, I know I just said that they run slow, but when it's a brand new application and there's like not a lot going on, it runs way too fast to demonstrate. So here we have it here. First, we're going to write a second test for creating a post. The test visits the post URL, and we're going to click on the new post button, just like a user would, fill in the post attributes for title with system test demo, and fill in the content with some lorem ipsum. And just like a user would, the test clicks on the create user button, or create post button. And then when we redirect, we can assert that the text on the page matches what we expect, which we expect there to be a system test demo file. And then you can run it with bin Rails test system. And now we see the Puma server boots and the Chrome starts and fills in system test demo and the lorem ipsum. And ta-da. There's your tests. This looks pretty simple. You may be wondering, then why did it take 3 years to build system tests? There are a few reasons that system tests took 3 years to become reality. The first is that system tests needed to inherit from integration tests so that they could use all of the URL helpers that already exist there. But integration tests were sluggish. Their performance was abysmal. There was no way the Rails team could push system testing forward through integration tests without major backlash from the community. Nobody wants their test suite to suddenly go from 5 minutes to 10 minutes. That kind of performance impact simply isn't acceptable. Speeding up integration tests had to happen before implementing system tests. In 2015, I worked with Aaron Patterson on speeding up integration test performance. Once we got integration tests to be marginally slower than controller tests, system tests were able to inherit from integration tests. Another reason they took 3 years is that, contrary to what many may think, the Rails core team does not have a secret Rails feature roadmap. Rails is a volunteer effort. And so if there isn't someone who's interested in implementing a feature, it's just not going to get implemented. Of course, individually, we may have an idea of what we'd like to see in Rails 6, but I'd hardly call it a roadmap. We each work on what we're interested in, and often features grow out of real problems that we're facing in our applications at work. And system tests are a really good example of this. Prior to working at GitHub, I was a programmer at Basecamp. When we were building Basecamp 3, we decided that we needed to add system testing through Capybara. I saw firsthand the amount of work it took for us to get system tests running in our application. This was a major catalyst for getting system tests into Rails 5.1. The work required to get system testing into Basecamp 3 re-inspired the motivation to work on the feature so that others could do less work in their applications and focus on what's really important, writing software. So this past August, David asked me if I'd be interested in getting Capybara integration into Rails 5.1 for the release. These are definitely the words that he used. Most of my work on Rails has been in the form of performance improvements, refactorings, or bug fixes, so I was excited to build a brand new feature into the Rails framework. There was just one problem. I had literally never used Capybara before. I know that sounds ridiculous, but beyond writing 3 or 4 system tests in Basecamp 3, which I admittedly struggled with, I had never set up an application with Capybara, nor written an entire test suite. This did have some pros, though. I got to experience firsthand what was difficult about setting up Capybara, especially for a beginner. I had no assumptions about what was easy or hard when I began development. Having no experience with Capybara allowed me to see the feature from the perspective of Rails and Rails applications. That's not to say that Capybara does anything wrong, but Rails is extremely opinionated about what code should look and feel like. For Rails, it's important that implementing system tests was easy and required little setup so the programmer could focus on their code rather than test configuration. When you're implementing something that you're unfamiliar with, it's best to have a set of guiding principles in order to make decisions about design and implementation easier. Without these goals, it's easy to get sucked into scope creep or bike shed arguments about little details. Having guiding principles means that for any decision you can ask yourself, does my code meet these guidelines? So for guidance with building system tests, I of course use the Rails Doctrine. The Rails Doctrine is a set of 9 pillars that drive all decision making for code that goes into the Rails ecosystem. While I was building system tests, I would regularly base decisions on the Rails Doctrine. System test meets all of these requirements, but I'm just going to take a look at 3 that I think really make the point about how it meets those requirements. The first is optimize for programmer happiness. This pillar is the overarching theme in all of Rails and Ruby. Rails' entire goal is to make programmers happier. And frankly, I'm spoiled because of this. Writing Rails makes me happy, and I hope it makes you all happy too, if you get to do that with your daily life. But you know what didn't make me happy? All of the implementation required to get Rails running in Capybara. The code here is the bare minimum that was required for your application to use Puma, Selenium, and Chrome for system testing with Rails and Minitest. Many applications had to do this multiple times to be able to use multiple drivers with their test suite, or had much more setup because they wanted to support different browsers with custom settings. Rails 5.1 means that you can use Capybara without having to configure anything in your application. Programmer happiness was the driving force behind getting system testing out of your application code and into Rails. You don't need to know how to initialize a Rails application with Capybara. You don't need to know how to set a driver. You don't need to know how to pass settings to the browser or how to change your web server. System Test and Rails abstract away all of that work so that you can focus on writing code that makes you smile. If you're an RSpec user, Capybara integration was already implemented, but Sam Phippen has just opened a PR to replace the Rails system testing in RSpec with the Rails system testing because he knows that what I wrote are, in his words, just better. That's what he said to me. I'm not making this. So if you use RSpec, please test out his pull request and find any bugs that he wrote and that I definitely did not write. So all you need is this simple method driven by. When you generate a new application, the test helper file that's generated along with it will include this method. If you upgraded your application, this file will be generated when you generate your first system test. All of the code that we looked at previously is contained by this one method. It initializes Capybara for your Rails app, sets the driver to Selenium, the browser to Chrome, and customizes the screen size. Rails values being an integrated system, a monolithic framework, if you will, that addresses the entire problem of building a web application from databases to views to WebSockets and testing. By being an integrated system, Rails reduces duplication and outside dependencies so that you can focus on building your application instead of installing or configuring outside tools. Prior to Rails 5.1, Rails as a whole didn't address the need for system tests. By adding this feature, we've made Rails a more complete, robust, and integrated system. As DHH said in 2014, Rails was incomplete when it came to system tests. Rails 5.1 closes that gap by adding Capybara integration. You no longer need to look outside of Rails to add system testing to your applications. Very full water bottle. Not anymore. Rails values progress over stability. Yes, that often means that betas, release candidates, and even final releases might have a few bugs in them. But it also means that Rails hasn't stagnated over time. Rails has been around for many years, and the progress that we've made in those years is astounding. We care about our users, but we also care about the framework, meeting the demands of the present and the future, which means that sometimes improvements won't be stable. You also don't really know that a feature is quite right until someone else has actually used it. I could have spent years working on testing and improving SystemTest, but ultimately I merged them when I knew there were a few bugs left. I merged them when they weren't 100% stable because I knew that the community would find the answers to the problems that I didn't have and find new issues with the implementation that I just simply hadn't thought of. By valuing progress over stability and merging SystemTest when they were 95% done instead of 100% done meant many community members tested the beta release and provided fixes for bugs present in SystemTest. A few features were even added in that time, and some functionality was pushed upstream to Capybara. SystemTest progressed more by merging them when there were some bugs than by waiting until they were stable. Now that we looked at the driving principles behind system testing, let's look at the decisions around the implementation and architecture in the Rails framework. We're going to look at why I chose specific configuration defaults and the overall plumbing of system tests in Rails. The first configuration default I want to talk about is why I chose Selenium for the driver. The barrier to entry for system tests should be 0 and be easy for beginners to use. In Capybara, the default driver is rack test. I didn't think this was a good default for system testing because rack test can test JavaScript and it can take screenshots. It's not a good default for someone who's actually trying to learn how to test their system. I also had quite a few folks tell me on the pull request that they thought Poltergeist was a better default choice because it was faster and, well, that's what they used, so naturally it's better. While it is true that Poltergeist is popular and faster, ultimately I chose Selenium over Poltergeist for a few reasons. One of the coolest things about Selenium is that you can actually watch it run. Poltergeist and Capybara WebKit are headless drivers, which means they don't have a graphical interface. While they will produce screenshots and they can test JavaScript, you can't actually see them run. Watching Selenium tests run in a real browser is kind of magical. At least I think it is. I really enjoyed watching code that I write run automatically. And because of this, I think it makes it a better choice for new programmers, especially people those learning Rails and Capybara. Because you can physically see the test run, it's easier to discern what's happening and what you might be doing wrong. The best part about system tests is if you don't like it, you can just change the driver. To change the driver that SystemTest use, open your SystemTest helper file and change the driven by method from Selenium to Poltergeist. That's it. Of course, you're going to need to install Phantom.js, which is another reason I kind of didn't choose Poltergeist, because that's like a lot of extra system configuration. And you have to add as your gem file and then add a require. But changing the actual driver is super simple. Rails isn't going to stop you from passing whatever you want here, but Capybara is only going to accept Selenium, Poltergeist, Capybara WebKit, or rack test. Another decision that differs from Capybara's longtime defaults is that Rails uses the Chrome browser with Selenium instead of Firefox. Chrome is widely used and has a greater market share than Firefox. In general, I do development in Chrome, and so I feel like a lot of people do development in Chrome, and I know that a lot of folks really like Safari, but Safari is not quite there yet, so that wasn't going to be a good default. Another reason that I chose Chrome is that for a while, Firefox was totally broken and didn't work with Selenium 2.53. You had to like downgrade to some super old version of Firefox that wasn't secure anymore to use it. That's since been fixed, but when I started working on SystemTest, that was the case, and that was one of my motivations for choosing Chrome, because there's no way that I can merge SystemTest with a broken default configuration. I would have like so many open bugs on Rails that I just wouldn't want to have to deal with it. If you want to use Firefox instead of Chrome, simply change the using keyword argument from Chrome to Firefox. The using argument is only used by Selenium driver and the other driver, because the other drivers are headless and have no GUI, so they wouldn't be using something else. I'd love in the future to support more browsers like Safari, so if someone is looking for some Rails contributions, I will accept that pull request. Driven by has a few optional arguments that are supported by all drivers except for rack test. The screen size argument sets the browser's max height and width, which is good for testing your browser at different, your website at different browser sizes, or setting the screenshot size. Driven by also takes an options hash that is passed to the browser initialization for Selenium, or the driver initialization for Poltergeist and Capybara WebKit. This can be useful for passing options that we don't explicitly define in Rails but are accepted by Capybara, like the URL option. One of the coolest features of SystemTest is that they automatically take screenshots when a test fails. This is good for freeze framing failures so that you can see exactly what went wrong. This works with all drivers that are supported by Capybara except for rack test. Included in the SystemTest code on the Rails framework side is an after teardown method that takes a screenshot when the test fails if screenshots are supported. And we're going to take a look at them in action. So first we're going to change our test that we wrote before to assert that the text is SystemTest failure. And when we run the test, it's going to boot the server just like it did before, fill everything in, and we can see we have a test failure. And up there is a little link to an image. We can open that and we can see that the text here is SystemTest demo, but we're looking for a SystemTest failure screenshot, and that's not on the page. And so that's why the test failed, and we can see that physically with our eyes. If you have like a way cool terminal than I do, apparently you can actually insert these like right into the terminal, and that's super awesome. I obviously use the regular one that comes with Apple. I don't get fun things. You can change the screenshot. You can also take a screenshot at any point when your test is running by calling the take screenshot method. This can be useful for tools like PercyCI for comparing front-end changes, or for saving a screenshot of what your website looks like at this point, so that you can use it for debugging purposes. One of the less obvious features of system testing is that database cleaner is no longer required. Those of you who worked with Capybara before will know that the transactions during Rails test runs with Capybara wouldn't get properly rolled back. So what everyone did instead was just install some other gem that cleans their database on every run. It had been the status quo for many years that Active Record was just broken and unable to roll back transactions when tests were threaded. The basic gist of the problem was, when a test was started, Rails testing code would start a transaction on a database connection. And then the web server would open a second connection to the database on a separate thread. When the test runs, database inserts or updates will happen on the second thread instead of the thread with the transaction. When the test finishes, inserted or updated records are not rolled back because the fixture thread cannot see the web server thread. If the inserted or changed records aren't rolled back at the end of the test, future test runs will fail due to uniqueness constraints or other issues with leftover data. I spent a really long time building SystemTest trying to solve this problem. It took me a while to understand the real issue with Active Record, and I was also surprised at how many years others had just accepted that this was an issue with Rails. I wanted to solve it so that I didn't need to tell everyone that they had to use yet another dependency, when really the problem was Active Record. Almost, I didn't know how to fix it. Concurrency isn't one of my strengths, so I had to ask for help from the two people who know more about Active Record and concurrency than I do, Aaron Patterson and Matthew Draper. The problem was that Aaron and Matthew had differing opinions about how to fix the problem. I first tried Aaron's way, which was to tell Active Record to check the connections back in when they were done with them. This broke a whole ton of Active Record tests, because you can't check a connection back in when the transaction's open. Then you just kind of break everything. Matthew came up with a better solution that him and I ended up implementing that forces all threads in a test to use the same connection. So when the test starts, the transaction is started and a database connection is opened. When the Puma server starts, it will be forced to connect to the database using the already existing connection instead of creating a new one. That way, all of the database inserts and updates will happen on the same connection as the original test transaction. All of the data will be rolled back when the original test transaction is closed. Now, before you get scared, this does not affect production. It's just in tests. do not change anything about databases on tests, although there are some bugs in Postgres, if someone wants to help us fix this. Without Matthew and Aaron's help, this would have been, I don't know if I would have solved it. You all would still be using Database Cleaner, which is fine. I mean, it's a great tool, but Active Record was broken. We should fix Active Record. Anyway. So we spent a lot of time looking at individual settings and the public API for system tests. So it's time to take an in-depth look at the plumbing in Rails that makes all of this work. None of the code that we look at here you should ever have to touch. This is just everything that was abstracted away by Rails so that you don't have to worry about any configuration and instead can focus on writing your tests. System tests in Rails live in Action Pack under the ActionDispatch namespace, right next to integration tests. And they inherit from integration tests, so you can use all of the URL helpers that are already implemented on the integration test side. This entire class can't fit on the slide, so I'm going to go through the methods as they're called by your Rails application. So when you run a system test, start application is called. This boots the app and starts the Puma server. Your system test helper file then calls the driven by method. This is where the default configuration settings are implemented. When driven by is called, a system testing driver class is initialized, and with the arguments that you passed in. The driver object is initialized with name, browser, screen size, and options. The browser argument is only used by Selenium. The running test is then initialized. It's important that we call use here on the driver in initialization so that the driver is set when the individual test classes are initialized. This allows you to use multiple drivers per test suite. So you can use Selenium and Poltergeist depending on the test class that you're using. The use method calls register if the driver is not rack test. Rack test has no options, so we can simply go straight to setting the driver in Capybara for that one. I hope you're all getting it that rack test does not have a lot of features, and that is why I chose it not as a default. Register is a case statement that then registers the appropriate driver. The register Selenium method is how Capybara sets the browser to Chrome with the options and screen size passed in to driven by. And then finally, the use method calls setup, which simply sets the current driver method in Capybara to the driver you passed into driven by. This is the basic plumbing that was required in Rails for system testing. It's relatively simple, but it's great now that none of you have to write any of this. Okay, now we're going to do Realtalk. One of the things that struck me about working on this feature was how different it was than building features or a product for a client. I think this is in part because open source work is so public versus client or product work is usually a big secret until the big reveal. You're probably thinking, duh, it's open source, so it's public. But almost all of the work that I've done previously was related to performance improvements, refactorings, or bug fixes. Those are the kinds of things that folks don't come out of the woodwork to comment on. Performance isn't the type of work that people care a lot about when it comes to style or implementation. It doesn't change their application except for making it faster. But adding a brand new testing framework, that is something that everyone has an opinion about. In the 3 months that the system test pull request was open, I got 11 reviews and 161 comments. This highlighted one of the big challenges of open source for me. It's really difficult to not feel like you're being constantly judged. Doing open source work makes you extremely vulnerable. It can feel like every comment, every commit, and every code change is open to public scrutiny. This is one of the hardest things about working on open source, and I think it's one of the things that keeps newcomers from contributing. I'm on the Rails core team, and I still get an adrenaline rush when I push to master. I still start sweating if the build fails after I merge a pull request. I broke rack on 4.2 the other day, apparently. That made me sad. I've been doing open source for many years, and I still feel vulnerable. It's difficult to remain confident and keep your cool when you're doing publicly visible work. I often had to fight the urge to rage quit all of it because I was just tired of debating the choices that I'd made. Even if the other person is right, it's exhausting to feel like you're having the same conversations over and over and over again about implementation. But really, public debate is an inherent part of open source, and you're always going to have to argue your position. So when your confidence is shaken, and it can be tempting to look for ways to find consensus with everyone who is reviewing your work. The desire to find consensus isn't unique to open source. What's unique is that the stakeholders that you're trying to find consensus with have varying levels of investment in the end result. When you're building a feature for a company or a client, you usually know who your stakeholders are. Those are the people who care most about the feature that you're working on. But with open source, you don't really know who's going to be invested until you open that pull request. Of course, I knew the Rails team cared, and they were a stakeholder. And I knew the Capybara team cared as well. What I wasn't prepared for was all of the other people who would care. And don't get me wrong, caring is good. I got a lot of productive and honest feedback from community members. But it was also really overwhelming to feel like I needed to debate everyone who had varying levels of investment. Rails' ideologies of simplicity differ a lot from Capybara's ideologies of lots of features, and all the individuals who were interested in the feature had differing opinions as well. Which driver was the best default? Was it okay to change Capybara's longtime defaults from rack test to Selenium? Was it even desirable to include screenshots by default? I struggled with how to respect everyone's opinions while building system tests, but also maintaining my sense of ownership. I knew that if I tried to please all three groups and build system tests by consensus, that I would end up pleasing no one. Everybody would end up unhappy because consensus is the enemy of vision. Sure, you end up adding everything that everyone wants, but the feature will lose focus and the code will lose style, and I will lose everything I ever felt was important. I needed to figure out a way to respect everyone's opinions while without making system tests a hodgepodge of ideologies and feeling like I threw out everything I cared about. I had to remind myself that we all have one goal: to integrate system testing into Rails. Even if we disagreed about implementation, this was our common ground. With this in mind, there's a few ways to keep your sanity while dealing with multiple ideologies in the open source world. I think the biggest thing is to manage expectations. In open source, there are no contracts. You can't hold anyone else accountable except for yourself. And on top of that, no one's going to hold you accountable either. You're your boss and your employee. You're the person who has to own the scope. You're the person who has to say no. There are a ton of extra suggested features for system tests that I'd love to see, but if I implemented them all before I merged system test, they still wouldn't be in Rails. I had to manage the scope and the expectations of everyone involved in the project to keep it in budget. While I greatly respected everyone's opinions on system tests, ultimately I was building the feature for Rails. System tests needed to fit in with Rails' look and feel. To do that, I had to work with Capybara's ideologies, that acceptance testing should be robust and have many, many options. There's nothing wrong with that approach, but it doesn't follow the Rails Doctrine. Capybara didn't provide a clear enough path for beginners to get system testing into their Rails application. In the end, it was the Rails team who was going to decide when system tests were mergeable. Since I was building the feature for Rails, I first honored Rails principles and everyone else is second. When you're building open source features, you're building something for others. If you're open to suggestions, the feature might change for the better. Even if you don't think you'll agree, you have to be open to listening to the other side of things. It's really easy to get cagey about the code that you wrote. I still have to fight the urge to protect the system test code. I wrote it and I put a lot of time into it, so I'm protective of how it looks and feels. But I have to remember that it's no longer mine and it never was mine. It now belongs to everyone who uses Rails, so I need to be open to suggestions, tweaks, and changes. Which brings me to my last point. Open source doesn't work without contributors. A perfect example of this is how I merged system tests when I knew they weren't 100% stable. I did this because I didn't know how to fix a few bugs like displaying the correct number of assertions or how to run system tests separately from Rails test. The best part about this was that the open source system worked. You can't push an unfinished project live and ask your client to contribute and improve upon your work. They would fire me. But with open source, you can build a foundation for other people to work off of. I didn't merge system tests with known issues because I was lazy. I did it because I knew that there were contributors that could help me fix the problems when they tested them in a real application. And when the Rails team released RC1 less than a month after the first beta, all of the issues I knew about before merging were fixed by other contributors. That's not to say there's not new bugs they found, just the ones I knew about were fixed. Capybara's maintainer added mini-test assertions to Capybara. Previously, users who were running system tests with mini-test would see an incorrect number of assertions because Capybara used to handle those just the RSpec way. This is one of the things that I wasn't sure how to fix. And I'm really happy that it got pushed upstream. And it's a huge win for system tests. Robin850 sent a pull request that changed system tests so that they don't run the whole suite. We didn't want system tests to run when you run Rails tests in your application because system tests can be slow, and since they're using your browser, so by default, they needed to run separate from Rails test. These two contributors help make driven by more robust so they could be used on a per subclass basis rather than globally. When I originally designed system test, it was intended to be a global setting because I kind of assumed that if you were like a Capybara power user, that you would just use Capybara. But once system tests were merged, it turned out that everyone really liked it, so we had to make it a little bit more flexible. So these two contributors really helped with that. And Renchap helped improve screenshots to make them configurable to display differently based on environment settings. In fact, he's the guy who did it so that you changed the screenshots so they show up in your terminal, which is awesome. I knew this was a problem when I merged, but I wasn't sure how to fix it. He came up with an elegant and easy to use solution. And this was also his first Rails contribution. So all of these improvements in system tests from other contributors highlight the real beauty of open source. That it doesn't work without contributors, it doesn't work without you. Open source is for everyone, by anyone. Contributing to open source isn't easy, especially a mature framework like Rails. But Rails has an astounding past and a bright future because of all of the contributors that care. Don't believe anyone who says Rails is dying because frankly the future has never been brighter. Every day I see new contributions improving the framework, and one day that's going to be yours too. Rails can and will benefit from your contributions in the future. Just like these contributors who push changes to system tests, you too can make system tests and Rails better. By contributing, you define Rails' future. I hope that you enjoyed learning about system tests and my process for building them. I also hope that I inspired you to contribute to open source and especially Rails in the future. Thank you.